This is Kaido, the man who dominates the One Piece world on land, sea, and air, which I do believe are all of the things, and he is said to be the strongest creature in the world with a very Kai-do attitude, but Kai does, or Kai doesn't, he challenged the very top tier of well-rounded antagonists in One Piece. Well, we're going to find out because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring an intro that I haven't even finished writing, so insert something clever, it's Kaido. So usually I don't like to leave scripts incomplete, but I've made an exception for this man, because Kaido himself believes that he is incomplete. And I'm not entirely sure that fictional pirate creator man Eiichiro Oda was able to complete him either. But this is a long story, and the first thing to note about the Kaido is that he is the world's slowest burn character. Kaido was originally mentioned in chapter 432 by Monkey D. Garp, which is also where we see Kaido's infamous and hilarious original silhouette, and this was way back in 2006. Oda took a name we'd never heard and he immediately equated it to the likes of Shanks and Whitebeard, which is very important because 2 chapters later Shanks and Whitebeard would clash, splitting the sky open, and what that act meant for Kaido is that for a man who wouldn't appear for another 350 chapters, Kaido stocks opened at an extreme high. He instantly became one of the most highly anticipated characters in the entire series, because he was one of the 4 emperors of the Yonko, and we just seen what they could do. It was lots, so people could not wait to meet him. However, wait they would. Oh, would they wait? In fact, if you started school in 2006, then you would not only have graduated high school, but also likely have graduated university by the time that Luffy was actually fighting Kaido during the raid on Onigashima. But we later learn on Thriller Bark that Gecko Moria was defeated by this man, granting us another vaguely Kaido-shaped hype nugget. And just before the Paramount War, we learned that Shanks had confronted Kaido in the New World. Then on Punk Hazard, we saw Luffy and Trafalgar Law form an alliance to take down Kaido, which is what officially put this boy on the menu. But even then, after this moment on Punk Hazard, it would be another 2.5 years before we actually met Kaido, which finally occurred in August 2015. 8 years and 10 months after his name was first said by Garp, Kaido would be officially introduced in chapter 795. And Kaido has easily the best introduction of any One Piece character in my opinion, hero or villain or whatever's in between. Nothing tops this, and it took four whole pages of narrator dialogue dedicated to introducing Kaido. This is a man who challenged the Marines and the 4 emperors and was caught 18 times and endured 1,000 tortures. He was sentenced to death 40 times. When he was hanged, the rope snapped. When he was put under the guillotine, the blade cracked. When skewered, the spear broke. Ultimately, he sank 9 different prison vessels, meaning none of these people were able to kill him. And that included he himself. His hobby is word I can't say on YouTube, and his name is Kaido, King of the Beasts. People say in a one-on-one fight, always bet on Kaido. Land, sea, and air. Out of every living thing in the world, this pirate is said to be the strongest creature alive. And again, there is no better introduction in the series, and I don't think there ever will be. Although those last words were some that Oda would come to regret writing. But even after this introduction, it would be a further 2 years before Luffy made contact with Kaido, which finally occurred in chapter 922, which was published a full 12 years after we first heard Kaido's name. And from here, it became Eiichiro Oda's job to now pay off the 12 years of setup and expectations that he conjured. I think the only other antagonist with a slower burn in this series is Blackbeard. He was introduced well before Kaido and still has yet to be dealt with. And Blackbeard is also going to be extremely difficult to handle in a satisfying way when we do fully dive into him. But for now, it should be noted that Kaido was a ladder antagonist. He was set up as the peak, and we had to climb Caesar Clown, Don Quixote Doflamingo, and Charlotte Katakuri slowly and arc by arc just to get to the opportunity that is Kaido. So Oda charged himself with writing and implementing a worthy saga climax antagonist that should theoretically top all 3 of the characters it is that I just said. Did Oda achieve that? Look, probably not. I mean, yeah, in the case of Caesar, that's kind of a freebie, but I personally think that Kaido has a really rough time stacking up against the other 2. And one of Kaido's most commonly cited problems by the fan base is his motivation. However, I think that Kaido has a much stronger motivation than he tends to get credit for. And it is something that only gets stronger the longer One Piece goes on. Kaido had an assortment of goals, but he was mainly working towards starting the greatest war that the planet had ever seen. And also to claim the One Piece in and become the Pirate King, but that wasn't really his prime focus. But the war stuff, it's a fascinating goal. I get that it sounds a bit bland and generic at first, because that's exactly what I thought, but appreciating it requires diving a bit deeper, so consider this. Whether this was intentional or not, Kaido was trying to bring Kozuki Oden's prophecy to fruition. In his journal, Oden stated that 20 years after his death, the world would be engulfed in the biggest war it has ever seen. So this wasn't just war for the sake of war. This is an event that fate has predetermined will happen, and Kaido could very well have been the man to kickstart it. And I also think this hits a lot harder post-Olbaf, because in retrospect, Kaido very much fits one of the descriptions of the sun god Nika, which is obviously the destroyer reading of Nika. And whilst Kaido does not believe himself to be either Nika or Joy Boy, in fact, we're not even sure if he knows about Nika, despite that, Kaido is still doing his best impression of both of them, as when King asked Kaido if he could change the world they live in, Kaido replied, "I'm the only one who can change it." And furthermore, when stating his goal as clearly as possible, Kaido quantifies it as, "We're going to take all of these pampered, noble-born rulers and drag them off their ivory thrones down to the battlefield with us. That's what I call equality and freedom. A world where only war decides a man's true worth." And what really piques my interest most about this is Kaido's use of the word freedom. He believes that plunging the world into war is what will provide the ultimate freedom and equality. To provide equal opportunity for everyone to have and do whatever they want, not because of the families or the wealth that they're born into, but because of what they go out there and take with their strength and willpower. I'm not saying it's a sound philosophy. Obviously, under Kaido's system, you're still born with very natural advantages. But the point is that Kaido wanted to destroy the world as it is and rebirth it in his own ideal image, which is very similar to the Harley prophecy about ending this world and beginning the next one. And Kaido's ideal image is, dare I say, not too dissimilar from what the ancient giants and even some modern day giants believe, that they should exist in a world where physical strength dictates everything. And that philosophical connection is perhaps not surprising, given that Kaido and the rest of the Oni race are almost certainly descendants of the ancient giants. And so Luffy versus Kaido ends up being a clash between two individuals embodying opposing principles of the sun god, although neither of them are trying consciously to do this. But what you have is Luffy on Wano fighting for the liberation of his friends, whilst Kaido is fighting for general destruction. And Wano is a test case for what would happen to the world at large afterwards. Are we going to go down the path of liberation, or are we going to take the rocky road of destruction? So Kaido's goal is definitely something that I appreciate so much more now that we're several years removed from Wano. It definitely packs a lot more punch in retrospect after we learn about the sun god, the Harley text, and the mural and all of that. But in the moment of Wano, it did feel a little bit generic. It was very much bad man wants to destroy world by starting big war. But to give Kaido more credit for the time, it is deeper than that, because he was also looking for the perfect end to his life. This is an aspect of Kaido that I find really interesting, and I wish that it was expanded upon a bit more. But Kaido has this reverence for death, an almost worship of dying in, quote, the right way. And Kaido is jealous of both Whitebeard and Goldie Roger because he claims that they, quote, did it right. And that's likely because both of their deaths triggered what he wants to do. It closed off the old era of the world and began a new one, with both Roger and Whitebeard having a much greater effect on the planet in death than they had in life. That is what Kaido wants for himself. And the reason why he's so fixated on death is because Kaido possesses a body that is essentially impossible to kill. He has, for all intents and purposes, immortality, which is very similar to what Prince Loki of Elbaf experienced when he tried to end his own life by jumping down from the Sun Realm to the underworld and being brought to tears by the fact that he could not harm himself, which is a problem that Kaido can sympathize with, as he did the same thing in his introduction by jumping off a sky island. This is a classic case of always coveting the thing it is you can't have. Most people don't want death, and they're quite aware of just how easily it could come, because most life is extremely fragile. But Kaido is on the other side of that fence. He is so robust that he couldn't end his own life no matter how hard he tried, and that's a big issue for him because Kaido has a key philosophy that it may not be the way of the times anymore, but death is what completes a person. Kaido cannot die, and he thus views himself as an incomplete person. And this is going to sound really morbid, but Kaido is also actively jealous of those that he kills because they get to achieve that completion. Kozuki Oden would be the primary example of this. Kaido recognized that Oden died in such a spectacularly complete manner that it actively enraged him. And furthermore, the only reason why Momonosuke is even alive is because Kaido didn't deem this pathetic child worthy of being given a complete death by his hand. So Kaido threw Momonosuke into the burning Oden castle to have his life completed in a substandard manner. So Kaido does have this thread going for him during Wano, which is something. It's a pretty nice something. But for me personally, like almost everything else about Kaido, I feel like we don't get to explore it anywhere near as in-depth as I would have wanted. It is there, it is flagged, but there's not a lot of meat to bite into, which is something that very much extends to Kaido's backstory as well. And just before jumping into that, just a quick note on expectations. I've done this already, but I really cannot emphasize just how long readers and watchers were waiting to see Kaido's past. From the moment that Garp first mentioned him in 2006 to the point at which we did receive Kaido's flashback in 2022, and also in a more active sense, Kaido was this antagonist that we had actively been building towards throughout the whole New World era. Caesar, Clown, Doflamingo, Katakuri, and even Big Mom were just stepping stones to reach this man. So 16 years later, it is finally time to get to know Kaido, and when Oda does grace us with this flashback, it plays out like a fast food drinks menu. We see Kaido in small, medium, and then large, and that's just kinda that. Kaido's flashback does shed a bit of light into why he hates the established nobles of the world, because his king as a child tried to sell him to the world government, but everything else feels very much like Kaido was here, then here, then here, and now he's here. It's really missing that usual Oda flashback punch, where you get hit with something emotionally substantive, like Big Mom's flashback, for example. That provided such a fantastic insight into her as a character. We see her childhood on Elbaf in detail, we see her friends, her struggles, her cannibal lubbles, and Oda took his time to flesh out this story over 2 whole chapters. And 2, I get it, that might not sound like a lot, it's not traditionally one of the bigger numbers after all, but Big Mom got 2 whole chapters for her flashback, whilst Kaido got 3.5 pages for his. And Kaido is meant to be an escalation of an antagonist above Big Mom, which is why it feels like nothing happens in his flashback, because Oda's got no time at all to tell a story. He's just got to hit the main beats of Kaido's life and call it a day. And just to draw this comparison, Kaido's introduction in chapter 795 took 4 pages, so it took longer for the narrator to introduce Kaido than it did to tell his entire backstory. But to be as fair as I can to Oda, I can't help but feel that he was fairly heavily shackled with Kaido's backstory, because his true origins more than likely lie in the Elbaf plot thread of the ancient giants, and a massive part of Kaido's history has to do with the Rocks Pirates, which some light has now been shed on, but it's also being kept quite deliberately mysterious, and anything with King is being kept a secret as well, because that pertains to Joy Boy, Nika, and the great mystery that is the One Piece world. So there's only so much that Oda can actually show without blowing the load of some of the biggest overarching plots in the series. But also, in the interest of fairness, Oda himself admitted that he rushed the end of Wano, and he did this because he wanted Shanks to appear outside of the island in time for the release of One Piece Film Red, which at the time was an incredibly hype moment, but as the years continue to pass and Film Red fades from the consciousness of the fanbase, all we're really left with is a rushed ending to Wano, and Kaido is one of the biggest victims of that in my opinion. I mean, obviously I can't be certain, but if it wasn't for that coordinated meta-marketing effort, I wonder if Kaido may have gotten a backstory about the same length as Big Mom. 2 chapters, that's all it would have taken, and I think it would have been great. But what this comes down to is that when people invest, they expect a payoff. And the larger the investment, the larger the amount they expect to pay off. So let's say that you invested a ton of your time into the story stock market. After a year, you would want that investment to have grown and give you a reward for investing that time. But also, it's only been a year, so you don't expect too much. If you've only invested a short amount of time into a character, then you don't have high expectations. However, if you invested your time into Kaido Corp for say 16 years, then you would have extremely high expectations of the return that you're going to get on that investment. Why did I choose 16 years? A very specific number. Well, that's because it is almost the exact length of time from Kaido's first mention by Garp to his defeat at the hand fist of Luffy. Altogether, 617 chapters of One Piece, which at the time of this recording is over half of the series as a whole. For that entire time, the shadow of Kaido was lurking and emerging. And just for fun, what I've done right is I put Kaido's data into an S&P 500 historical calculator, because I think this illustrates the point quite well. Let's say you invested $1,000 dues into the S&P 500 in October 2006 when Kaido was first introduced, and what you would have by May 2022, which is when he was defeated, is that investment would have grown to over $4,000. Obviously, you'd have to adjust for inflation and other things, but the point is is that long-term investments are expected to come with pretty great rewards. And the reward that we as readers got for investing 16 years into Kaido was 3.5 pages that you could honestly cut, and it probably wouldn't hugely impact Kaido's overall impression as a character, if indeed it would impact him at all. And I do think that's a pretty big failure for an antagonist of Kaido's position. This wasn't Punk Hazard. We can't just get away with a throwaway antagonist. This was Wano. This was the climax of the Four Emperors saga. Although another factor that very much needs to be considered is that Kaido is a dual antagonist. He does not helm Wano on his own, and he shares his role of concocting Kokiri with Kurozumi Archie, who acts as the spiritual and emotional threat to the island. Everything that Kaido is missing is present in Archie. In fact, I do think that Archie gets in total about 2 chapters for his flashback, but everything that Archie is missing is present in Kaido. And together, they make a pretty damn good team. But when you examine Kaido on his own, which is what this video series is all about, he does feel a bit superficial, because his role is to be the club. He is the spectacle antagonist, here to provide the raw strength and the cool fightings, which he does do absolutely flawlessly. Kaido is responsible for giving us some of the most memorable action in the entire series. It's always a fearsome and brutal pleasure to watch him fight in whatever form he so chooses, and specifically his fight against Gear 5th Luffy will go down as one of the greatest battles in One Piece, and in my opinion, shonen history in general. So full marks there, but even that opens up another issue. One of my least well-aged comments on this channel was that around 2018-2019, I said that Luffy would not be able to beat Kaido one-on-one. In my mind, this was going to be a group effort from the worst generation because Wano was so stacked with them: Luffy, Zoro, Law, Kid Killer, Hawkins, Drake, and Scratchman Apu. So I was thinking that this would be less of a one-on-one showcase and more of a one generation topping the previous generation kind of affair. And I was very, very wrong. But in my defense, I wasn't the only one at the time who couldn't see Luffy defeating Kaido one-on-one, because the author Eiichiro Oda himself was also grappling with this idea, and in 2016 he stated, "When Kaido was introduced, I said Luffy can't beat such a strong guy yet, and I've yet to learn how Luffy will defeat him. My audience won't be satisfied if the reason for defeating Kaido is just because of Luffy's strong punch, so Luffy and I must find a solution." Oda was afraid that he'd made a mistake by making Kaido as strong as he is. At the time that Oda introduced Kaido, he could not see a way for Luffy to beat him. And during Act 1 of Wano, this impression was not helped by an intoxicated Kaido one-shotting Luffy in his then most powerful form. Because from here, Oda had to come up with a reasonable way for Luffy to beat Kaido in the span of 2 weeks of in-world time. And the way that he did that was by accelerating Luffy's development like we've never seen before. To defeat Kaido, Luffy had to unlock 3 separate upgrades in a single arc. He had to master Advanced Armament Haki, then Advanced Conqueror's Haki, and then awaken his Devil Fruit. And the first 2 of those upgrades were nowhere near enough. In total, Luffy lost to Kaido 3 times. 2 of those after the Haki advancements, and it was only after unlocking Gear 5th that Luffy finally overcame Kaido. And how did Luffy finally overcome Kaido? Well, he did it with one big, strong punch, which is the exact thing that Oda said that his audience wouldn't be satisfied by. Although I would actually make the less cynical argument that it wasn't just, one big, strong punch. Because Gear 5th, it was about discovering creativity, versatility, and imagination. It was about using the strength of Luffy's imagination to bridge the gap in power between he and Kaido. But I also can't deny that ultimately Luffy did beat Kaido with one big, strong punch, and as much as I love this fight in general, I'm not the biggest fan of ending it with Bajrang Gun, and I do wish we'd found a more creative end for Kaido than our standard thwack in the face. Although, to refute my own argument there is something quite charming about having the infinite power of imagination and then just going, well, how about I hit him with a really big fist? That usually works. There's a lovely Luffy simplicity at play there, but it is still a kind of underwhelming defeat for me, which puts a neat little bow on everything that is Kaido. He had so much potential to be the greatest antagonist that One Piece has ever known, but he's held back from reaching the top of that podium in almost every area. His motivation is very compelling but underexplored, and only truly appreciated after his time. The emotional heavy lifting of the Wano arc is given to Orochi, so Kaido doesn't have a lot of meat there. Oda also accidentally made Kaido too powerful, he admitted as much, and he struggled to satisfactorily beat him. And even Kaido's defeat itself is kind of undermined because he isn't even the first Emperor of the Sea to be beaten in his own arc. Big Mom losing to Kid and Law a few chapters prior takes that piece of landmark hype away from Kaido. But look, with all of that said, Kaido, he was a great villain, like a really great villain. But I just don't know if really great story is enough to meet the bar that Oda set for him. And maybe one day we'll have a more full picture of who this man was once we hit a full-on Rocks Pirates backstory if such a thing ever happens. But for now, Kaido is just missing something, or even a series of somethings that so many other One Piece antagonists have that make them feel complete. Kaido, he felt incomplete to himself because he was unable to die gloriously, and he feels incomplete to me because his story wasn't fully told. And if it was fully told, if this is it, this was the intention all along, then to put it bluntly, it just wasn't as good as so many other antagonists who came before him. And as a result, I think that A tier is more than fair for Kaido, still a top tier bad man, very compelling, but not one that reached his full potential. And you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next.